Hello and welcome. Let's check our
Attendees.
participants are filing in. It's so good to have you all here. Tasha, you're not really in the screen. There you go.
There you go.
Do we have any housekeeping while we're letting people come in?
Everything's been going really well.
Yeah, so far the chats have been awesome.
We've only kicked off about 20 of you.
We
You
never
guys are
have problems with these kids.
You guys
You're
are so
the
great.
best.
So thank you for that. Thank you for being awesome. We are so excited. I've been like shaking with anticipation for this lunch keynote by these amazing women. I think our plan is to introduce Roseanne Brown, who will be our moderator for this event. And then Rosie is going to take it from there and introduce our esteemed keynotes. Do you want to introduce?
Absolutely. So Roseanne A. Brown, or Rosie, was born in Kumasi, Ghana, and grew up in the wild jungles of central Maryland as a child. Her debut novel, A Song of Wraiths and Ruin, was an instant New York Times bestseller. She currently lives outside Washington, D.C., where she can usually be found wandering the woods, making memes, or thinking about Star Wars. She is represented by Caressa Robinson of Nelson Literary Agency.
Welcome, Rosie. You have the floor. Thanks, guys.
Thank you guys so much for having me. I am so excited to be here. This is the first time I have worn real clothes in close to like 4 weeks. And you know what? It's going to be awesome. So I'm here today with two authors whose work I just adore. And I'm just so excited to dive into world building. Just a quick rundown for you guys there in the audience. So the way this is going to work, we're probably going to have around 30 or so minutes for the keynote for the discussion. And then we'll probably save around the last 15 to 20 minutes for questions. So make sure you drop those questions down below in the little Q&A box thing down there. If it's in the chat is already moving really fast. So we're probably not going to catch them. Okay, so let me first introduce our lovely panelists today. First off, we have Leigh Bardugo, who is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of the Grishaverse books, which are coming to Netflix this April, which spans Shadow and Bone trilogy, the Six of Crows duology, The Language of Thorns, love that book, and King of Scars, love Nikolai. Ooh, on top of also Ninth House, which was the Goodreads Choice winner for Best Fantasy 2019. Okay, you guys, Grishaverse, if you're not on it, get on it. Like, just oof, oof. And we also have Rena Barron. Me and Rena go way back. Oof. Rena Barron is the author of the young adult fantasy novel Kingdom of Souls, which recently sold rights to Warner Brothers with Michael B. Jordan, aka Forever Bay. And she's also the author of the middle grade series Maya and the Rising Dark. Me and Rena, we were in the same Pitch Wars class, 2017. So like we have been through it. Like, yes. When I saw her name was there, I was like, oh my God, yes, I get to do it. So just two amazing, some of like the best fantasy like I have read, which is why I'm very excited. This was all a deploy for me to actually pick their brains and talk about fantasy. But so we're just gonna dive right in here. So for the first question for you guys is, can you guys just tell us a little bit about the worlds of your works and kind of what inspired them?
Do you want to start, Rena? Like, how should we dive in?
Okay.
I'm sorry. Yeah, Rita, you start. I got too excited.
We'll have Rosie pick on us. She'll just call us randomly, but I'll start first. So my young adult series is the Kingdom of Souls series. The first book is Kingdom of Souls. The second book is Reaper of Souls that just actually came out a month ago, actually. And so the world building in this series is this ideal that you can trade years off of your life in exchange for magic. But each time you make that trade, you don't know how many years you're losing. So it could be 1 year, it could be 10 years. And we've got this main character who, she was born to a powerful family of witch doctors, but she does not have magic. So she's already the oddball of the group. But she sees that this great evil's rising. And no one's listening to her. They don't believe her. And she's one of these people who just cares about her family and her community. And she makes this ultimate change. So she's not trading years off of her life for something like basic. She's doing it to literally save her world. And so that's where the magic system is that trade of years.
Okay, so most of my books take place in the Grishaverse. And I'm primarily starting in a country called Ravka. that was inspired by Tsarist Russia of the mid 1800s. And the magic system, since we're talking magic systems, is really just loosely based on molecular chemistry. The Grisha never refer to what they do as magic. They call it the small science. And in fact, one of the frequently repeated statements is like calls to like, which is actually Leigh's like middle grade science knowledge, which is like dissolves like. But the idea is that you cannot create matter, and that to create matter or to try to animate matter is forbidden. It's taboo. It violates the making of the heart of the world. Yeah, that's the magic in the Grishaverse. But things get a little wild when you get to the King of Scars duology. That's when you start getting into the heart of magic, which actually, I don't want to interfere, Rosie, but I'm very curious for both of you, because you're both mid-trilogy, right? Like you're in the course of
yeah.
Right. So I have constantly been getting the question, like, did you know you were going to write this many books in the series? And both of you have these incredibly rich worlds and these amazing magic systems. And my question is, like, right now, are you sitting there being like, I've got 8 more books? Or are you like, I just want to get to the end of the trilogy?
Rosie, you want to go first?
Okay.
Allow me to put you
actually,
on the spot, Rosie. The tables have turned.
I had a plan. I was gonna follow it, but it's all good. But, so for me, I'm actually in duology, and I actually like right before. So y'all don't tell my editor I'm actually on deadline. So like as soon as this is like over, I'm actually have to go turn that into her. That might have been due yesterday, but don't worry about it. So I'm a duology, and so for me with the 2 books, it's been less kind of like do I have all this stuff? Like, how do I fit as much as possible into the tiniest space possible? So there's very much been learning to go from like the 3-act structure to like the 1-act, 2-act, like kind of Broadway structure. So that's kind of been how I've been working with that.
Yeah, I think for the Kingdom of Souls trilogy, I knew that I could not tell the story in 1 book. And many people will say like, there's a lot packed into book 1. There's a whole like journey that's happening. And then you get to the end and you know that you've only scratched the surface. And I knew that it would take minimally 3 books. But I think after 3 books, I can have it all kind of the story told the way I want. I don't think I need more than 3 though.
We'll see.
Yeah,
we'll see.
Yeah, I just have like so much respect for you authors who do like trilogies or even longer book series. Cause I'm here at book 2. I'm just like, I gotta do this, like, imagine doing this again. What? Well, and I have a question about that. We'll get to that, but back to the plan.
Yes, the plan.
So
I'll
you guys both mentioned, you both mentioned your worlds are inspired by different real world cultures. And I know that's something that a lot of the writers here, you're wondering, how then do you balance when you're dealing with these traditions and these beliefs and these cultures that are so real to people in the real world? And how do you respect that while also leaving room to add these fantastical elements that we all love about fantasy and still make it your own? Like, let us know. Let's start. Leigh, you start this time.
I think for me, Tsarist Russia was always just a jumping off point. It was a touchstone. And the same thing was true, when I started moving towards Kerch and Ketterdam, you can see other influences start to leak in. So on the one hand, you can say, okay, well, Ketterdam is obviously inspired by the Dutch Republic of the 1700s, and that's obviously Amsterdam. Except if you read it, you'll find Venice, Las Vegas, early New York. And I think as we start moving through our series and gain confidence, we're like, I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm going to pull from where I want to. That said, I've taken a lot of flack for my world building. I've had people come after me for playing fast and loose with Slavic languages, but I also have a lot of readers in Russia and Bulgaria and who have loved the books. So I think you do have to make a certain amount of peace with trying to be as respectful as you can, but also understanding that you're not ever going to make everybody happy.
I think that's a great answer. I think that the way I approach looking at the representation in my book is by being respectful foremost. And if you go in respectful, that's a huge point. And much like Leigh, so my book is inspired by West African culture, but it's also very much inspired by Southern Black culture in America. And the premise of the book is inspired by things that happened in my childhood. So there's no way to kind of separate that. So everyone's kind of tale becomes very unique to their experience. I would never assume or think that I could represent a whole culture. All cultures are complex and beautiful, and there's so much going on. And I think you just have to kind of pick your pieces that represent kind of how you relate to that culture. And then there are some people who are going to, like Leigh said, there are some people who are going to relate to it. I've had many people from across West Africa who have loved my stories, but I have also had people that have said, like, this doesn't represent the way I see things. And that's okay. That's normal. I think it really is kind of finding like what your unique view is. And every author is going to come into their world building with their very unique view and how they were raised and the influences that were in their lives. And I think that's something to take in consideration. But the number one thing is to be respectful, and to know when you're making sure that you're not feeding into stereotypes, making sure that you're not kind of creating this narrative that isn't really true. And that's where a lot of the research come in as well, where you're kind of making sure like, oh, maybe I need to gut check and then research and see kind of where I'm going with that. But I think that's the key for me.
Ooh. I love that you brought up research there, because that segues really great into my next question, which is about, like, on the craft side, how do you sort of incorporate research into your process, and like kind of what stage you start really weaving that in? And then also, what is the absolute wildest thing you have either learned or done while researching for a book? And so let's start. Rena, you can go first this time.
Yeah. So I incorporate research throughout the process. So it'll be at the start, middle, and end. So I would just say in general, I just never stop researching, because there's just always something new to learn. As I had mentioned, like the initial premise for Kingdom of Souls kind of started when I was a kid. It was a lot of people in our community practice voodoo. And I didn't know what that was, but it was something that I was always kind of interested in, and I didn't really understand it. So I started researching that. And then I tried to understand, well, where is that connected to? And so then that took me down the rabbit hole to kind of understanding those West African influences and those connections, and how it was so incorporated into African American history, from folk songs to poetry and all of these things. So it was really fun to be able to see like, oh, I was told that, my culture was, cut off from Africa. But when I dig a little deeper, I was able to kind of see like all these little strands of connection. And so that was kind of where I started. And then one of the things that I looked at that wasn't surprising, because we see it a lot in the media, is the ideal of voodoo is treated as something that's dark and dangerous and forbidden. And the first thing that I noticed when I started researching was all of this like, oh, this is horrible, this is horrible. And then to dig past that and to look at all the ways that it's been used for good, and the way it's treated, it's interesting how it's been westernized to be this thing, this demonic thing. And so digging deeper than that and being able to see a lot more that's kind of been hidden. I don't know what's the craziest thing I've done for research or the craziest thing I've found. I think in general, the thing that has surprised me the most is just growing up in America, we tend to, as far as mythology, we tend to see mostly Greek or Roman mythology, some Norse mythology. I never saw any African mythology when I was in school. Like that was never taught to me. We were pretending to be Greek gods in school for class, but we never had like, like learned anything about African gods. So I feel like for me, the most surprising thing about research is that it opened up so much knowledge of my history and my family for myself, that it kind of just made me feel like, oh my gosh, I'm more complete now. I still got a lot to learn. I have not learned everything. I never will, but I feel like, it expanded my knowledge base.
Yeah, that's interesting, because with Ninth House, I was researching Ladino and Sephardic death songs, and I found this access to this whole other side of my culture that I really didn't have, because I'm half Sephardic and half Ashkenazi, but I was raised by the Ashkenazi side of my family. So that for me felt like this incredible, like, deep opportunity to discover. And I don't think it's a coincidence. I think we're hungry for something, and that's part of what draws us to these stories and saying, I want my job to be essentially opening these doors and getting to explore these places, because there's something in us that wants it. With the Grisha person, so probably the weirdest, grossest thing that researched was so if you've read Six of Crows, well, I don't want to give away a spoiler, but there's something that Kaz does, and in the Ice Court heist. And in order to research it, I ended up researching something called water gouting, which is it's disgusting, but it's something David Blaine like went on this whole like mission to discover what water gouting was. And there's all these videos of it, of essentially people vomiting water. It was very glamorous, let me tell you. So that was gross, but it was very good. But I will say, when I was researching Ninth House, so for me, research usually is sort of the secondary part of the story. With both Ninth House and with the Grishaverse, I usually begin with a bare bones plot. Like, I need to know that there's enough story there that's going to carry me through, because I saw somebody talking about in the chat, they were saying, you know, all I have is a prologue. And for a very long time, that's all I could write was like prologues, first chapters. Maybe I'd get through the first act, but I just didn't know how to carry myself through the entirety of a draft. So for me, having that outline and understanding where I'm going is pretty vital before I really dig in. And then the research phase, you know, these days, because I'm usually working on something else, that's something that's happening while I'm working another draft or promoting something. But back when I was writing Shadow and Bone, I essentially gave myself 3 months, 2 months, I don't remember, but like a finite period of time, because research is vital, but it can also be a way to hide from ever going back to the draft. So, you know, it's sort of a love-hate, you know, and there's different kinds of research. There's the research where you know a specific thing that you're looking for. And then there's the research where you're just trying to get a feel. You're just moving through, you don't know how much you're going to use or you're not going to use. And with Ninth House, which is set in the real world, I shouldn't be talking about that. It's not for teens. Children don't read it. It's very dark. But the best part was I did get to go on a research trip to Yale. And as some of you may know, I walk with a cane. And that means you can get into pretty much any building everywhere, because all you have to do is be like, could you hold the door? And they're like, oh, well, I don't want to be that guy who closes the door on the lady with the cane. So I went places I was not supposed to be on that campus.
Wow, you know what? That makes perfect sense. I had never considered that, but you know what? Kudos to you. Kudos to you. God, sometimes you just, like we used to say, journalism, you got to get the get. And you know, yeah, you got the got. I did not say that right, but you know what? We're all good here. And I'm, y'all just stealing my questions, man. Why am I even here? But so I'm so glad you brought up the sort of the structure and the idea of how the different parts feed into each other, because I know one of the things that sort of really changed the way I viewed world building for me is I was listening to Holly Black talk, which if you guys can ever listen to Holly Black talk, go listen to her talk. Like, if your options are sleep or listen to her talk, listen to her talk. And she was talking about how, like, in the best worlds, this idea that the world itself has an arc. Like, we always tend to think of arcs in terms of character, like the character is like moving towards something, they have their goal, they have all this fun stuff they're doing, but the idea that this world itself had an arc it was moving towards, and that it was moving forward towards something. But sleeping aside, what point was I even making? Why did I bring that up? Oh gosh,
you were talking about this amazing thing that I had never heard before, and I was like, go on, about the world having its own arc, which I love.
Yes, I cannot take credit for this. That is Holly Black, wherever she is. Thank you, Holly. But like the idea that the world itself is moving towards something, and this idea that you're giving every part of your story forward momentum, and this idea that it all sort of tastes together. Like, so not only is the world influencing the character is thus also influencing the world and helping the world push toward wherever it's going, whether this arc for it is good or bad. And I bring that up because it really made me start thinking about the relationship between character, setting, world, theme, like, and the way they are all woven together. And so my question for you is, when you're starting a new project, sort of in what order do these come to you, and sort of how then do you weave them together? How do you make sure your setting is influencing the characters in the best way possible, and that everything is tying together in the way it needs to? And Rena, let's hear from you.
Well, I would start by saying that characterization and characters come first for me. Always, it's usually something about the character, and then like some spark of world building. So with Kingdom of Souls, it was this ideal of a girl without magic having to trade years. So then you kind of take that initial like little sentence, little idea, little spark, and you expand on it. So, well, if she doesn't have magic and she can trade years, so who does have magic? And then, well, yeah, there are people who have magic, but they're only from certain cultures and certain backgrounds. Why is there? you know, and then when you go from why that is that, and it's because of that and that. So you ask yourself questions. That's really how I kind of do the world building. And all of these things, the characters influence kind of what the world is, in particular in Kingdom of Souls. And I can't really give away too much because as you read the arc of the series, you can see that the world is so tied and interwoven to the character arc and what our main character R is going through. It's inseparable. They're both kind of tied together. And I think for me, the best stories are the ones in which the world is important to the story, because it can't be just backdrop, right? It's not just something that's there, like it has to influence the story. And it really is kind of just making sure that happens and weaving them together.
I think for me, I always sort of break down world building into sense of power and sense of place, right? These are the two things that your reader is going to be looking for as they enter the world. And they're going to be taking everything as a signpost, right? And making every bit of information counts maybe a lot more in those early chapters as they're building their sense of just trying to get their bearings. And I mean, what I would say to the young authors in the audience is, don't just look at science fiction and fantasy for world building. This is always the way we talk about it, but the fact is good world building and bad world building exist in every genre of literature. So the next time you're reading a book and you're really sinking into it, maybe look for those things, sense of power. And power isn't just magical power, political power. It can be interpersonal power within a family, within a school, within a town. It goes from micro to macrocosm. And if you can start marking the way that you get introduced to those things in the early chapters of a favorite book, then you'll begin to understand because world building itself is actually not that hard. It's introducing your character to the world. And it's something I'm still working out. Like, people will be like, this is so dense. It's so, there's too many names. And I'm like, but they're important names, so they're important names. Yes. I admit I am a sucker for those kinds of worlds. I love lore. I love mythology. I love the sense that there's always something else that you could pull down any book on the shelf and open it, and there would be a story in that world. So, but to look for those things, and then to think about sense of place, language, food, weather, and then you begin to see the way these things interact. And I also think that, research is actually a vital part of that. If you don't know if you haven't lived under a dictatorship and you want to write about a dictatorship, then research a dictatorship. Because again, that's not just going to be about political power. It's going to be about what people were able to eat, what they had access to. What did it look like to try to work in that kind of regime? What did poverty look like in that kind of regime? What did wealth look like in that kind of regime? And they will give you insight that will help to really improve the texture of that world.
Someone in the chat was just like, the way to world build is to just write down everything you know in a notebook, then open a Google Doc and just say how. And you know what? That's valid. That's very valid.
Whatever works.
Reminder y'all, please.
That works.
Exactly. If it works. And reminder y'all, please put your questions in the Q&A, because the chat, I cannot see it. I don't know if y'all can see it, but I can barely see what's happening over there. So please, Q&A box. But I have a couple more questions for y'all before we get to audience questions, which is, Leigh, you mentioned this earlier, sort of working through a series and working a series-wide arc. And so this one, honestly, this is a question for me. How do you keep a book feeling fresh? Like, how do you keep a series feeling fresh? Because, like, I know I'm here, it's only a duology, I'm in book 2, I'm just like, did I not write, is this not the same book twice? Like, have I just written the same book twice? And like, I know lots of the young authors here would just love to know, how do you guys both go through and make the installment feel not just fresh for you as a writer to keep revisiting the world again and again and again, but also for readers, and to have new corners and find new rocks to kind of wiggle under and find all sorts of good, creepy things under them?
I think you really have to listen to what your story pleasures are. Like, one of the things that happens to me when I'm working on something new, invariably there's a moment where some other idea will come to me and I will be like, I want to write that. I don't want to write this. I want to write that. And instead of trying to push that aside and ignore it, what I've started to do is ask, what is in that is making me want to write it? Because it may be that this book that I'm working on is telling me, I want more of this. I want more of this particular trope, this particular archetype, this particular adventure or journey. And to find that sort of juice that really makes you want to engage with it, because I really believe readers feel that when you are locked in that way. And also, like, the sequel, just so everybody knows, your first sequel, I think, is always the hardest book that any author will have to write.
Yeah.
And nobody tells you that. You're like, oh, I did it once. The second time will be
Tears.
easy. Lies.
Tears streaming down my face.
Lies.
Horrible.
Sequel, writing Siege and Storm, I remember I would print it out and cut it up and put it on the walls of my dining room, trying to find my way through this, because you are only just learning your process, and sequels are harder. You've opened all these doors, and now you're like, now I close this one, I have to choose another one. But the thing is, what you find is those characters and those ideas to lead you through. And I think as writers, a cruel trick we play on ourselves is to constantly be wanting to do something new. So, you know, when I started, I had left a Chosen One story with Shadow and Bone, and I wanted to write a heist story. Well, I'd never written a heist story before. When I wrote Ninth House, I wanted to write a murder mystery. I'd never written a murder mystery before. And it is a cruel game we play, because it's like you learn how to do one thing, and then you're like, okay, well, I want to try doing this other thing.
So I feel Leigh, I feel less bad because I want to write a horror flick now. Like,
do it.
Just like, I want to just do that. So I'm like, I'm going to move from fantasy to something else. I would add to that, as far as like how to keep it fresh across the series, like, I do think that in book one, especially if you know that it's going to be multiple books, that's where you start to thread in things. You add these plots that you know that there's some plots that are going to, so we talked about arcs, right? There are some arcs that are going to start at the beginning of book one and be done, you know, at different points in book one. But there are some things that are larger and overarching. They're going to be, you know, wrapped up in book two or wrapped up in book three. And those are things that I tend to think about, because I'm more of a plotter. I like to kind of think about the story ahead. And
this was again something I was like, more where you were talking about being a plotter.
Yeah, just being a plotter. And if you're thinking about a story, especially if it's something that's multiple books, you want to kind of seed in these ideal of the arcs that you're going through. We talk about the 3-act structure, but there are many different types of structures you can kind of follow and look towards. But it's kind of looking at the mini arcs and looking at the overarching arcs, and kind of making sure that makes sense. For me, with my series, the world gets larger every single book. It started in one place, one little the tribal lands in the kingdom, and by book two there are multiple worlds. And we'll see what I do for book three, but I think you can stay fresh by exploring. What haven't you explored that's relevant to the story? You don't want to just kind of throw in a bunch of random things, but what are things that you can explore that would actually be relevant to the characters, and that helps keep it fresh. But to Leigh's point, there is always this like other ideal in the back of your mind and other story that you want to write. So, but I think it's a curse, but it's also a blessing for writers, because that means that we always have something to look forward to.
Yeah, better to have more ideas than fewer ideas. Yeah, that's the fear. Yeah.
You guys are making me feel so much better, because on my book two, like literally last night, I had to just, do you ever have that moment where like your brain just like, it's just like, if I look at this again, I will just physically explode. I had to go get a sadness burrito, which is a burrito when you're very sad, because of how sad I was about my book. Like, and so, I had, okay, one more question before the audience questions. This one is more of a fun. If you could co-write a book with any character in your books, who would it be and why?
Oh God. I mean, I'm tempted to say Zoya, because she'd be so organized and like would never let me off the hook. But I also feel like I would eventually end up moving and changing my phone number when I was not able to meet deadlines. Like I'd be like, you're gonna murder me in my bed.
What kind of book would you write?
Yeah. A murder story. Yeah, I am torn. I feel like Kaz would be an amazing plotter. Like the dude would be like an amazing like mastermind plotter. So that's tempting. But again, I don't know how I feel about working with him. Like I would come home and all my valuables would be gone. So it's a tough question.
Oh, that is a hard question. Though I would love to co-write a book with Kaz. I feel like that's my dream come true, but you know, that's a whole nother thing. I guess I would love to do a story with Rudgick, because so he's the love interest for the main character Ara, and he's just so confident and funny and sarcastic. And I'm like, I'm none of those things. Can you like add that to my story so that like I could write something fun and adventurous? So I think that he'd be a great co-writer.
I'm pro that.
Yeah, I'm. Yes, man.
I don't know about writing a book with a love, like a YA love interest, though. I feel like they'd always be like looking soulfully into your eyes, and we'd all be like releasing a breath we didn't know we were holding. Like it would be a tough.
But you say that, but I would write a book with Nikolai in a heartbeat. Like, I don't even know what it'd be about. But I'm just like, Nikolai, he'd be like, so he'd write the whole thing. I'd be like, yes, Nikolai, whatever you want. Like, I just let him put his name on it. He doesn't have to do it.
He'll just lay beside you and look, and you'll just be writing.
I'm just like, I'm so inspired. Yes. Okay, y'all. So let's see this Q&A box. Let's see if I can do this without exploding the entire Zoom again. So let us see. Okay, we got a lot of good questions here. Oh, I like this question by Savannah. I'm gonna press answer live. That's what I'm supposed to do, right? I'm gonna do that. And okay, so the question from Savannah is, how do you keep intense emotion and keep your reader involved throughout the entire book?
I mean, look, we all write stories with big battles and fights and kissing, and like all of those things without emotion are choreography. And for me, I actually have a bad habit of writing choreography. When I'm trying to work out the plot of a book, I'm for me, it's always about like, well, how do I get to the next thing? Where's the midpoint? Where's the third act? And I will turn it over to my critique partners. And luckily I have very good critique partners who will be like, yes, but emotions, like, or they will like, for those of you who have read Crooked Kingdom, the only reason the Kazan and Inej bandaging scene exists is because Holly and Sarah were like, not enough, like we're invested, like give me something. And I was like, but they hold hands, and they were like, no, give us more, Bardugo. So for me, I think it's really about asking, what are the stakes for the character in each scene? There is no point to a battle scene, or hell, a whole heist, if each of those characters doesn't have to face some demon, real or figurative, in the course of that plot. You have to ask, what does the character have to lose at every moment of this, and what are they willing to sacrifice? And that needs to be on the page, even if they're sitting around drinking tea. That is the subtext of all of the text. And there's nothing that gives me more pleasure than writing in somebody's POV and having what they're saying versus what's happening underneath. Like that is like my great, and I love to write characters who can't express their emotions. So it works out well for me.
So all my initial drafts are very choreographed as well. There's like no emotion in any of those stories. But when I go back, it's about stakes, motivation, and internalization. So why are the characters doing these things? What's the motivation behind it? And like Leigh said, I really love when characters are saying one thing, but thinking something different. Because how many times do we do that in real life? Like if we think about it, we're really just drawing from how human behavior is. So we would say things and do something different. And that showing that internal and showing that struggle and showing those stakes is what drives the high emotion. So that's how you keep it high. You make sure that at every moment people are connecting with the character, because world building is great and we love it, but we read books for characters. And I think that always connecting to the character is what keeps the emotions really high.
I'm surprised to hear that you guys both feel like you start with the choreography, because I have the opposite problem. Like I have all the emotions. Like my first drafts are just people feelings and crying.
That's good.
And everyone hugging it out. And then my editor, she'll be like, Rosie, they've just been doing this for like 36 pages. I'm like, but it was a great 36 pages of like feelings fest. And she's like, go fix that. I'm like, yes, ma'am. So fascinating. I just love hearing other people's process. Okay, let's see. So we have a question here from anonymous attendee. Shout out to anonymous. How do you deal with the constant self-editing or negative criticism? And so Rena, let's start with you this time.
Well, I think writing in general is all editing. There's this saying, writing is revision. So the self-editing is a part of kind of what you need to do to write. Because no books are going to be perfect. The first couple of drafts, maybe dozen drafts. Every book kind of, it's very different. I think there's a point where you have to say that you've done as much as you can, and then you give it to critique partners and get feedback, because you can kind of really get stuck in this cycle. Well, you become kind of indifferent to it, and you don't kind of know what's wrong and what's not working. So critique partners are really great for that. And then once you're kind of with an agent and an editor, then they will kind of help you drive that as well. But as far as like kind of that, like having, I think it was negative thoughts or feedback, like if it's like
negative criticism.
Yeah.
So criticism.
Are we talking about internal or external criticism?
It just said negative criticism, so I guess we can cover both.
We'll do both. Internal, I think that oftentimes writers will think poorly of their own work because we want to be good. I think, and a lot of us are perfectionists. We say that we're not, but we really are. And we want to write our best story. And the way you see a story in your head and getting it on paper is so far apart. It's like a worlds apart, the way a story is in your head. And by the time you can get it to be as close as possible on paper, right? Because when we tell stories in our head, we're using everything. We're using all these senses, and words are a little bit different. And I think you just kind of have to remind yourself that even your most favorite authors have like negative criticism, either externally or internally from themselves. Like no one's going to think that everything is perfect, whether it's themselves or someone else. And as far as like external criticism, look, this is the business that we're in. It's the entertainment business, it's the creative business. You're never going to have everyone love your work. What you're looking for is to find the right audience for the stories that you're writing. And that audience is there. Those readers are there. And it's about finding them.
I mean, I think that in terms of, if you're a new writer, or hell, at any stage of writing, sorry, I'm swearing, and I know there are children, but, in terms of dealing with that internal voice, in the drafting process, you have to shut that voice down. And the way I did it with Shadow and Bone was I kept tricking the voice. The voice would say, this is garbage. No one will ever want to read this. And I would say, you're absolutely right. No one's ever going to see it. This is for me. This is for fun. And sort of tricked that internal critic through an entire book. That has gotten more difficult as I now get paid for my work and have deadlines. But for me, shifting to that drafting mode and really, the problem is discarding your taste, right? We are readers before we are writers, and we know what good is. We know what a good book is. And we know that our first draft is not a good book. It isn't. And it is so vital to remind yourself again and again that there is no song you've heard on the radio, no movie you've gone to see, no book that you've read that is a first draft or a second draft or a third draft, all right? So you cannot compare the first stage of your work to the work of people that you love and admire. And it is very hard to shut that down, but it's fundamental because that can really freeze you up. Write badly, write a bad, unoriginal, messy first draft full of false starts. And, I don't double back. I just keep going. I'll write 3 different versions of a scene and then will move on to the next thing. I'll write, insert awesome scene here and I'll move on to the next part. Eventually you have a reckoning with your past self. And then the book becomes good in revision. And that is when that critic becomes vital to you. And we've all seen writers we love stop listening to that critic and stop listening to their own editors. And then you think, what happened here? So being able to walk that line between the delusions of grandeur required for drafting and the abject humility required for revision is sort of the job of the artist. And it's a tough one. As for external criticism, I mean, stay off Goodreads, stay off social media, don't read your mentions. Like, I don't, and I will say too, when I was writing my first books, I had this one book from a series, and I'm not going to say what it was. It was not YA though. And it was so bad. And it's a huge bestseller. And every time I felt bad about myself, I'd be like, I'm going to read a few pages of this. And then I'd be like, if this book can succeed, I got it. Like, do whatever you can to get it through. The fact is, making art is a war. You're in a war against a culture that does not care about artists. It does not care about young artists, women artists, artists of color, does not care, okay? Until you have succeeded. So your job is to be a warrior and to keep creating art and to keep making art, even when you're being criticized, even when no one cares.
Yes. Oh gosh, one of my favorite things to do with that is I'll go to Goodreads. I'll look like books that like changed my life, like books that like they came to me like the moment
and read a
I needed them. I'm like,
yes,
exactly. I'm just like, what is wrong with you people? And like that always makes me feel so much better. And I'm like, and I'm like, oh, I'm so glad you brought. I feel like I said it like 5 times now, but I am so glad every time. because that is one more question. I think this is a good note to end on, which is there's been so much talk about the writing community. And like you mentioned, Leigh, like how there's a war against creators and like these spaces aren't safe for people from marginalized background, especially SFF, like science fiction, fantasy. We have all been seeing all the stuff that's happening there. And I know lots of young marginalized writers I talk to, they're very much like, why am I even doing this? Like to come into this space and like to just, you put all the work into improving your craft and then you get to the space that's built to like destroy you. And so I guess the question there, and I know this is a big question, we're not gonna like come up with the answer right here on the Zoom, but it's just kind of like, what changes would you guys like to see within the book community to make it a space that is more welcoming for writers from marginalized backgrounds, to help them thrive, to help become this space where they feel like they can come in and it really is about the words, about the writing, and it doesn't feel like it's suffocating them? I know that's a heavy question, sorry.
That's a big question.
That's a big one. We're gonna solve racism right now.
Yeah, that's the goal.
2 minutes.
In 2 minutes.
Yeah, but it's just more, it's more, if anything else, it's more for those marginalized writers in the like audience, just to know that like, what are we the ones doing here? How are we thinking about it? How are we helping, you know, and like just anything we have to give to them, really. That's the real thing.
Well, the one thing that
also if we can,
yeah,
oh,
the one thing I would say is seek out and find a community of other marginalized writers as a support system, because writing oftentimes feels like a very lonely world, you know, and to have those conversations, because oftentimes we feel very isolated and we feel like, is something really wrong? Am I making this up? Or, you know, but you then start to compare stories and you start to see patterns, and it becomes very clear that, you know, oftentimes marginalized writers are gaslit and they're ignored, or they're not kind of being treated fairly or paid fairly. And I think there's strength in numbers and having those conversations to be able to be vocal about it. I feel like there was once upon a time where we weren't able to even be vocal about these things, that we were very quiet about. Everyone saw it, we never talked about it. And the strength that comes in numbers, being able to get together and talk about it, helps a lot as well. And I think from the publishing communities, it really comes down to listening as well. Like we need publishers and readers and all the folks who are involved in marketing people, publicity people, to listen to what the actual issues are and not try to put a band-aid on it. Because we can't solve anything by that way, but like listen to the folks who are saying that these are problems. Listen to us try to work with you to create solutions. And I think that's something that still is lacking a bit in publishing. And you know, that's part of it. There's so much more we could say, but I want to let Leigh get a chance to talk as well, because I know we're close.
I mean, I look, my job is actually not in this moment to be like, I have pronouncements. But I would say from my perspective, my job is to boost voices that maybe are not getting heard. And I would say for readers, don't just read the one big book. You know, like something that drives me nuts, and this is across all titles, is that, you know, yes, there are lead titles, they're going to get a lot of hype, but like, don't read one book and pat yourself on the back. Like there are so many books that don't get the attention or the marketing that we would hope that they would. So, you know, follow authors of color, follow Black authors, follow gay authors, queer authors, Jewish authors, disabled authors, like follow those authors, listen to their recommendations, listen to what they talk about, you know, but when it comes to, you know, what we can do personally, you know what, I'll actually say, like, when we're working on a project right now and we went seeking freelancers for it, and we deliberately sought BIPOC creators because we wanted to make sure we were hiring diversely, inclusively. But did I ask what kind of deadlines those artists were being given? Did I ask what kind of pay they were being offered? No, I didn't. So I had to backtrack and fix that, because that stuff matters. It's not just a question of be like, oh yay, I'm so progressive, look at me hiring. Like, you got to think the whole thing through. And as somebody who's been a freelancer basically her whole life, I was like, that was a real shortcoming. Like, we can do better. So if you find yourself in that situation, like, it's okay, just do better, you know?
Yes, thank you. Thank you guys for taking that. I know that was a hardball question for the 5 minutes. So let's get off with I'm trying to see if there's like a fun question here among these. Oh, here's a fun one from, thank you, Anya. Here's a good one to end on, I think, and we'll have fast lightning round. How does it feel to kill off a character? That's the question. That is the question Anya wants to know. How does it feel when you take someone's favorite comfort character and you murder them?
I don't know what you're talking about. Look, all I can say is I get messages every day that are like, how could you? Why would you? Curse you. Sometimes much more colorful language. And all I can offer is there has never been a death scene that I've written that I haven't cried. Like that I haven't, like maybe not in the drafting, but in every revision. And then every time I read it and every time I try to refer back to that scene, like it is emotional for me. So there is a real sense of loss. And that's how I actually know that I'm having experienced grief and loss in my life, particularly in this last year. That's how I know I'm accessing authentic emotions. But when you tell me that I made you cry, I feel nothing but joy.
Mm-hmm. I love it.
Because I did my job right. If you didn't cry, I didn't do it right.
Exactly.
You know? So
Rena, your face just now, Rena was just like, I love making children cry.
I do. I mean, our job as writers is part of it is to get make sure we're invoking this emotion. We want readers to feel emotions. And unfortunately, guess what, readers, you're not always going to feel the positive emotions and the happiness and joy, but you're also going to feel grief and sadness. And that's the whole writing process, to make sure that you're kind of feeling this whole range of emotions. And yes, I also feel bad when I kill a character as well, because they are our characters. We love our characters, but we have to be true to the story and true to the arc that's happening. So if folks, no one died in fantasy, I just would be shocked by that. I don't know if that would work.
And also, like, it gives you a chance to feel those feelings. Like, if you haven't experienced grief in your life, then it gives you a chance almost to do a dress rehearsal and to learn the language of empathy for people who are experiencing that. And if you have, maybe it gives you a chance to revisit those emotions and those feelings in a safer space and a space at one step removed. At least that's what I hope. But I do feel incredibly powerful when everybody is like, real tears. I'm like, yes, keeps me young.
You know what? I feel like on the note of, wow, we love making children cry, I think that's just the perfect place to end this on. I just want to thank you both so much, even with all the tech stuff going on. Like, thank you both for this talk today, I feel like I just understand how to write things better, and just thank y'all, the chat. I know y'all have something happening in the chat. Looks like
Rosie, thank you so much. You were amazing. Thank you. Thank you for doing this. Thank you, Rena.
Thank you.
Thank you.